Uh, Good evening from a very dark and grey but rather warm Tokyo. I thought I would do a quick-ish video talking about my new book and its contents, Reality Switch Technologies, Psychedelic as tools for the discovery and exploration of new worlds. This is out on October 4th. You can pre-order now, either at my website, alieninsect.net, or from Amazon. The links are below. It's published on October 3rd, so you still have a few weeks before you will receive it, of course. Thank you, of course, to everybody who has pre-ordered signed copies of the book. They'll be sent out in the middle of this month, September. So you should receive those hopefully by the end of the month. So a lot of people have been asking me about how this new book, Reality Switch Technologies, relates to my first book, Alien Information Theory, Psychedelic Drug Technologies and the Cosmic Game, which came out 3 years ago now, in full color. I, of course, still do strongly recommend this. And people are asking me, is this a sequel or is it a follow-up to Alien Information Theory? And it is most certainly not. It is a completely different and independent book. Alien Information Theory was very much a highly speculative kind of vision of reality, if you like, a sort of what you might call speculative metaphysics. It was my vision of my idea of how DMT functions in the brain and how it alters the structure of our reality and allows us potentially to tune into an alternate reality, and vary, and how that relates to the fundamental structure of our reality and the origins of our reality, and where we might go kind of at the end of it. So highly speculative stuff. This book, on the other hand, Reality Switch Technologies, is very different. But before I talk about the book, for those of you who aren't familiar with my work, I'll just give you a brief introduction. People want to know about credentials and things these days, so I will tell you. So academically, I come from a mixed background. So I have degrees in chemical pharmacology. I have a master's in chemistry. I have a PhD in biochemistry from Cambridge University, and a postgraduate diploma in neuroimaging from the University of Edinburgh. I have also completed postdoctoral work in computational neuroscience at the University of York, the University of Oxford, both in the UK, of course, and most recently at the Okinawa Institute of Science and Technology Graduate University here in Japan. However, I have now left Okinawa and have relocated to Tokyo, where I work very much independently. Sort of outside of my kind of main academic work, I guess I'm most known for my work on DMT, my kind of speculations as to the mechanism and function and evolution of DMT's function in the brain. And I guess most recently, apart from my first book, I guess I'm known for working with Rick Strassman to develop or propose at least a technology for extending the DMT state from a few minutes to potentially several hours or even longer, by maintaining a stable DMT concentration in the brain. So effectively developing DMT as a technology for the exploration of those bizarre and fascinating domains to which DMT grants access. So that's kind of my background. So this book, it's kind of been glaringly obvious to me, at least, over the last, well, over the 20 years really or so that I've been studying psychedelics, that there really doesn't exist, or at least didn't exist until now, uh, a a book that really goes into great depth and detail, for a non-academic audience at least, in great depth and detail, from the level of receptors, drug receptor interactions, through to the effects on brain cells, on neurons, and how they interact with each other, and all the way up to the effects on global cortical activity, which manifests as this change in the dynamics and structure of your world, which of course is the psychedelic effect. So there's this huge gap in the market. People are very interested in psychedelics, and I'm deeply interested often in really understanding, how they actually work. And there are many books of varying quality, certainly, that do offer some kind of account of what's going on, and they will often talk about, how do you use psychedelics in their history, and generally a much kind of broader overview. But if you really want to develop a deep understanding of psychedelics and how they work, and not just the classic psychedelics either. So in this book, I also talk about the NMDA antagonists, ketamine-like drugs, the tropanes, these deliriant psychedelics that come from plants such as datura and mandrake, etc., as well as, of course, the reality-tearing molecules that are isolated exclusively from Salvia divinorum. So I wanted to write a book that explained in as much detail as is currently possible, given the current state of the science, in a way that is accessible to anyone with some kind of committed interest in understanding these molecules. This is not a light read by any stretch of the imagination. I do go into much more depth and detail than any other book that exists. It is quite a thick book, like 336 pages, I think. Okay, so that's kind of basically what the book is. I suggest strongly that you go to my website. There is a link below. You can actually download the contents and the first chapter of the book, so you can kind of get a feel for what's going to be in the book, and also the kind of the aesthetics of the book. Very much like alien information theory, I was very keen to create a book that was more than just a book, but it was actually kind of like a work of art, if you like, with very characteristic and distinct aesthetic, which you can see here a little bit at least. So here we have the contents page. You can see we have the first 7 chapters here, and then the other 7 chapters. We'll talk about these a little bit as we go on. So there are 14 chapters in all. And you can see there's a kind of, I don't know how you would describe it, there's a kind of a Japanese cyberpunk aesthetic that I wanted to create with this book. So here's the first chapter. Again, you can download this and see exactly for yourself. And I'm not going to go through all of this. This is just the introduction to the book. Okay, so please do download that now. So as I said, let's kind of get into the weeds a little bit with the book. So again, it's broadly a book about the kind of a detailed, comprehensive account of how psychedelics work in the brain, how they change the structure and dynamics of your subjective reality, of your own private world. I don't talk about things like clinical uses of psychedelics or dosages or modes of administration. All of that stuff you can find elsewhere. Go and read Michael Pollan or whatever, or go on the internet, go to the DMT Nexus or something, or the Shroomery or Aeroid, of course, and you can find out more sort of practical aspects of this. But the book doesn't focus on that. I deal with the science, the actual mechanisms, the detailed mechanisms of how psychedelic drugs work in the brain, like no other book that exists. Okay, so let's start. So the first few chapters of the book, basically chapters 2, 3, 4, and 5, I present the kind of the requisite neurobiological underpinnings, everything you will need to know in terms of how does your brain construct your reality? How does the brain construct this world that you experience in normal waking life? And how does that relate to the environment? So how is the brain using information from the environment to model this model of the world that your brain is constructing all of the time? So there's a lot of detailed, hopefully well explained details about how all of that works in those first few chapters. In chapter 6, we get to the kind of the fundamental concept, if you like, of this book, which is what I refer to as the world space. So it will become much more clear as you read the first few chapters of the book. But basically, your world at any point in time, your subjective, your own personal, private, subjective reality, is represented by information generated by a particular pattern of activation of your cortex, a particular state of your cerebral cortex, or certain parts of your cerebral cortex. And so your what you might call the consensus world, your normal waking world, is a small number of the possible, or relatively small number. It's actually a vast number, but a relatively small number of states within this huge, vast, practically infinite state space of the cortex, which I call the world space. So what this means is that any worlds that you can possibly experience when you are conscious are found within this world space. And so the consensus world, the normal waking world, kind of occupies this district, this small district within this vast terrain, this world space landscape, basically. And so when you take a psychedelic drug, what is actually happening is is very explained in great detail in the book. When you take a psychedelic, what it's actually allowing your brain to do is to reach previously kind of forbidden states or high energy states that are not normally accessible in the normal waking state. And this can be quite subtle, or it can be quite dramatic. So with DMT, for example, you are effectively accessing a region of the world space that is completely disjoint, is completely separate from the district occupied by the normal waking consensus reality states. And I go into great detail on exactly how that works, using what we understand about how the brain constructs your reality. So that's kind of a fundamental chapter 6. Then we move into chapter 7. So this is the world space switches. So this is where I talk about the very low level, what's actually happening when a molecule enters your brain, when it interacts with certain receptors and alters the way that these receptors function, and how that change in the receptor function modulates the complex network of signaling molecules inside of a brain cell, inside of a neuron. So this is the lowest level, really, and we look in great detail at how molecules can actually interact with receptors and with their particular shape and charge distribution, and how that affects the structure of the receptor. So that's kind of another kind I guess, sort of neuropharmacological underpinning that's required to then understand the specific psychedelics themselves. So then we go on to the second page of the contents. We have another 7 chapters. So we have 3 chapters that are devoted to what I call the C switch. The C is classic, so the classic switch. So the classic switch is basically the 5-HT2A receptor, this serotonin receptor. Again, if you haven't heard of that, you will understand all about it when you read the book. So this 5-HT2A receptor that is integrated with this subcellular network of signaling molecules. And so what we do in these 3 chapters is look at how, what happens when a psychedelic molecule like LSD or like DMT interacts with the 5-HT2A receptor, and how does that affect the function of a single neuron, first of all. So we start at the neuron level here. We've moved up from drug receptor interaction to the level of neurons. How does it affect the way that a neuron behaves? The activity, the activation level of a neuron. Then in chapter 8, we look at how this change at the level of the individual neuron affects the way that neurons communicate. How does it affect the way that information travels between these networks of neurons in the brain, which are ultimately responsible for constructing your subjective reality, the structure and dynamics of your world. So then we move into chapter 10, the C-switch level 3, which is the world space level. So here we're looking at the global changes now. We've moved from just sort of networks of neurons to the whole system. How do the classic psychedelics, such as LSD, which might affect the world in a relatively subtle way, certainly at standard doses, compared to something like DMT or 5-methoxy-DMT, where you get this astonishingly dramatic change in the structure of your world, which is obviously very different depending on the drug. So here we finally kind of bring everything together and look at how these classic psychedelics affect the structure of your reality. They affect the states within the world space, how the brain moves through the world space and the location within the world space. So then we move on to the other psychedelics. So we start with what I call the M switch. So this is the M1 muscarinic acetylcholine receptor, which is blocked by these tropane alkaloids. This is probably in the modern world at least, the least utilized of the class of psychedelics, because they are quite toxic and quite dangerous, and for most people far too wild and strange to kind of deal with. But they do alter the structure of your reality in quite profound ways, and so we should spend some time thinking about how they work. So in the M switch chapter 11, we go through that in great detail. Why when these tropane alkaloid molecules, they block these particular receptors in the brain, why does it have this dramatic effects? And again, we relate all of this back to what we learned in the earlier chapters about how your brain constructs your reality. So we're always referring back to that fundamental neurobiological underpinning that we learned in the first few chapters, which is quite important, I think. So then in chapter 12, we look at what I call the N switch. So these are the NMDA receptor antagonists, which include ketamine, PCP, and there's a whole range now of analogues which work in a similar way. And again, we go into great detail, basing it on the neurobiology and the neuropharmacology that we learned earlier, to try and understand what's going on with drugs like ketamine, both at low levels, kind of psychedelic dose levels, all the way up to the more dissociative anesthetic effects that happen at kind of higher plateaus of dosages. And then finally in chapter 13, we look at the K switch. K is for kappa, because the salvinorins, so the salvinorins are the subject of chapter 13, these astonishing reality-tearing molecules, just remarkable, which are unique in a number of ways, isolated from salvia divinorum. And so we spend a lot of time in this chapter thinking about the not only the unusual structure of these molecules, but the completely different way that they actually alter the structure and dynamics of your reality. So that's kind of, these are the main categories of psychedelics, which are explained in great detail in these chapters. The only kind of what I would consider to be the speculative chapter is chapter 14, the final chapter, engineering reality. So here I'm really looking to the future. And, I'm thinking about, well, if we have this world space, we have this this vast, practically infinitely sized terrain of possible worlds that a human can experience. And we already understand, to some extent at least, how these kind of embedded switches in the brain, activated by the classic psychedelics, the tropanes, the ketamine-like drugs, and the salvanorins, how they work. So I think to the future. I think, how can we actually start to use that knowledge and develop that knowledge to actually explore this world space. Each of these drug molecule types allows you to access a different region of the world space and to traverse this world space landscape in distinct ways. And so there will come a point in the future, I think, where we're actually able to kind of engineer molecules that will allow us to access to kind of direct vectors through the world space into specific locations, which will allow us to explore its vast terrains. So that, of course, remains speculative, because we're not there yet. But it is, unlike Alien Information Theory, the other book, it is the only kind of speculative chapter that really does think about the future and how we develop these psychedelic molecules, and also using post-molecular technologies, which is also talk about at the end of the book, how we might use them to actually engineer our reality, to explore these strange and fascinating domains. Okay, so that's basically the book. I think I've covered pretty much everything. As I said, the book is published on October 3rd. You can pre-order from my website, again, alieninsect.net or buildingalienworlds.com. It's the same website, links below, or you can also pre-order from Amazon, wherever you are in the world. I think I have covered everything, so thank you very much for listening. I've gone on quite a bit. If you have any particular questions about the book, then do write them in the comments below, and I will do my best to answer them. So thanks very much for listening, and I will see you again.